For over 1 billion Christians, the Easter weekend is the most important time of the year. It's a reminder of loss and renewal and is celebrated across many churches in many ways. It is said that as many as 70% of all Americans follow some form of Christian church, separated into several smaller churches. Celebrations can include special services, special meals, and the swapping of eggs, the symbol of rebirth. Nowadays, it's easy to celebrate, but 120 years ago, it was very, very different. But to understand that, you need to travel back a little ways further. Ever since Tudor times, Europe has been fascinated with exploration. The first settlers made their way to Mexico to plunder the gold that resided there. But for some Europeans, they settled in the untapped north, now present-day North America. As more people chose to settle in this new land, it was the perfect opportunity to venture out and find land to claim, and this is exactly what the people did. Unfortunately, this came at the expense of many indigenous people who, faced with the reduction of their land and increase in disease, they started to see their own numbers decline. Fast forward 100 years or so, and the early settlers grew into early towns. The towns, however, were only prosperous if the base resources were there. This meant that towns were often abandoned as people moved on. This upheaval also had an impact on the buildings themselves. It was deemed unwise to build solid foundations, and brick buildings were uncommon. Many towns carried bare bones, including only a few stores and inns. Churches, despite the town's dependence on Christianity, were simple affairs with travelling ministers going from town to attend to people's spiritual needs when needed. When missionary bishop William David Walker took over his church in late 1883, he faced a large problem. The majority of his flock was still chasing gold in the Midwest, and as such was still on the move. The only connecting point for many of these towns was the emergence of the railroad. Railroads were vital, as it was this that allowed both people and goods to move easily. This gave the bishop an idea. If the clergy couldn't get to the church, then maybe the church could get to the clergy. To be fair, he didn't come up with this idea. Instead, it was when he was on a pilgrimage to Serbia, and he visited the Trans-Siberian Railway, and had seen examples of what they called chapel cars. These were railroad carts that contained everything the bishop needed in a church. This included pews for the people to sit, an altar, even a font. Considering the number of people in these towns was small, it would be perfect for his diocese. Walker took the ideas home with him and took them to the church leaders. The leaders thought it was a brilliant idea and started to hold fundraisers. Soon, word of the venture reached the ears of Cornelius Vanderbilt. Vanderbilt was the grandson of his namesake. The elder had made his fortune in railroads and was one of the richest men in America. Before he passed in 1868, he named his grandson as his heir apparent, following his determination and great work ethic. Cornelius, the younger, was moved by the idea and in an act of charity gave Walker a large donation. It was enough for Walker to approach one of the best carriage companies of the age, Pullman, to make it. The new car from the outset was very different from anything Pullman had built before. For starters, it had a transept, with the stained glass window in the roof. The transept separated the 60-foot car into two parts. One part is where the sermons would take place, and it even had an organ and a font. The latter half would form Walker's living quarters, including a makeshift office where he would plan his movements and his services. As the diocese intersected many different railroad companies, he would have to approach them in advance to ask them to move the car. Normally, railroads would be obliging to more private stock for a charge. However, considering the cargo, the majority did it for free. The workers would ensure that a siding was free close to the station where the locals could board easier. Even the crews and the staff would benefit. By using this method, Bishop Walker was able to travel over 70,000 miles before the carriage was retired in 1898. But it wasn't just Bishop Walker. Other bishops were having the same problem. Bishop Williams didn't have the funding from Vanderbilt, but had to make do with 2 refurbished cars. They proved rather useful, especially in the small town of Octogonagum. The town, like many others, was mostly made of wood, and with the town's biggest export being lumber, sawdust was everywhere. One August was so dry that most of the land was a tinderbox. A fire was discovered one afternoon, but the wind propelled it into the town. It leapt from house to house, and by the end of the day, 1 person was dead, dozens injured, and over 2,000 people were homeless. As many churches were burned, Bishop Williams took his mobile church instead. For the townfolk, having just him there to listen was a great comfort. By then, the idea of chapel carriages had really caught on, and the Barney and Smith Car Company of Ohio decided to produce them semi-commercially. They standardized the chapel car and made 7 out of a 13 run. The cars had simple interiors, which was understandable, considering the financial climate the USA was now experiencing. Still, the cars, now called Chapel Railroad cars, did their jobs perfectly, and were used by different organizations up and down the country. One car called Emmanuel served the northern and western states until 1942, when it was decided to retire the carriage due to its age, and the fact that many townspeople had settled and stone churches were now being built. The chapel was decommissioned and changed to a meeting room in South Dakota. 13 years later, the car was sold for scrap. However, at the last minute, its true purpose was realised, and over a 30-year labour of love, it was restored to its chapel state. Ultimately, it was recognised as a monument and added to the Register of Historic Places. Chapel cars were a fantastic way to connect distant communities with spiritual requirements without the need of a solid structure. It gave people comfort, a place to go, and a place for quiet prayer, whether it be saying goodbye to someone special or celebrating unions and births. Chapel coaches helped by making communities seem that little bit closer.